Hey, what's up? This is May 8th, 2016. This is the voice of a guy whose first name is Eisel, his last name is Mazar. You probably know me from my YouTube channel, which is called à-bas-le-ciel. This is my first attempt to invite and answer questions from my supporters on Patreon, and I really do appreciate the support I've received from everybody. I'm going to start by answering a question that nobody asked, which indeed concerns the money, and is a way of thanking you guys for your support already at this stage. I think as of today, I've only been asking for donations on Patreon for 6 or 7 days, and as you guys know, I've encouraged people to give the minimum, not the maximum, which I think is a much more positive thing in the long term. I mean, I'd much rather have, a large number of people with each person just paying $1 than I would to have a small number of people paying large amounts of money, but where that support is inconsistent or difficult to justify, or where I can't really provide value from my end, where it's a struggle for me to be producing enough content, enough quality content, to reward someone who's donating $100 or what have you. But I really do appreciate it. And look, as of today, I believe the total amount I'm receiving in donations per month is now over $200 $200 per month. And if you guys watch my channel, you know I am poor enough that this is not an insignificant amount of money to me. When I'm in China, I'll be earning $850 per month. I think that's the current exchange rate. In the Chinese currency, 5,500 yuan. I think it's about $850 off the top of my head. So yes, $200 is a significant amount of money. Although you guys already know the story, my reasons for doing this at this time are not fundraising. But I think one interesting question that nobody asked, and I'm going to answer anyway, is of whether or not in future I might really turn my attention towards fundraising proper, of trying to raise the most money I can, either for a project or a foundation. Now that is a real temptation for me, and I think that's a real career path that's open to me. I do have a fairly deep background in the nonprofit sector, both in terms of my study of charities and what I've learned from participating in them myself. Really, there's a third category. This is going to sound a bit strange, but some of you will know the truth of it. I learned a lot about humanitarian work from doing it and from studying it. But you know what? I probably learned the most from the third category of conversations in cafes. Informal talk with people who had years and years of experience in that sector. And I had a lot of conversations of that kind over many years. As much as I learned from books, some of those conversations face to face were even more valuable. Probably, if I hadn't done the book reading, I wouldn't have known the right questions to ask. I wouldn't have known how to appreciate what I was being told. But you learn a lot off the record, informally, by interviewing people. So anyway, I do have that kind of background, and it comes up every so often in my life. So in the past, I worked in museums. I did NGO-related work, NGO-related research in Southeast Asia, so charity work, whatever you want to say. I also have a long history of involvement with Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, which included the critique of what they do and don't do in the charity sector. Just a couple of months ago, a friend of mine in Hong Kong was complaining on the internet about the failure of Buddhist charities to address some current crises in the world. And I wrote to him right away with a real plan of action, saying, look, if you want to set up your own foundation, here's how we do it. Step 1, 2, 3, 4. And I was able to speak in real detail to really present a plan of action that we could start on tomorrow, and where within 5 years we could really have a serious foundation that would employ the two of us. It wouldn't employ 10 people or 50 people, but it would at least employ the two of us in doing real work that makes a difference in the world. And I said, look, here's how we'd set it up legally. Here's how we do the fundraising. If you want to get serious, let's talk. So that friend of mine, if he's hearing this, he knows who he is. I've only got one friend in Hong Kong, so he's... I think it's fair to say he is the only friend I still have from my years of involvement with Buddhism, which is very sad and reflects badly on that whole scene. I still have a couple of friends who are involved with the Hindu side of scholarship and academia, actually, but none of the Buddhists have stayed in touch with me. And I wish they would. I have actually had, by the way, I have had some fan mail from people who started following my web presence because of Buddhism and who became vegan only because of my content on the internet. So they discovered my work because of Buddhism and then listened to what I had to say about veganism and made the change. So it's a nice positive thing that spun out of that. But my point is here in my intro to this Q&A session is that yes, in the future it really is possible I will devote my energies to setting up and operating a charity or a nonprofit foundation. And of course, veganism would be a large component of that. How exactly you define that foundation, what exactly it does, whether it's focused on Asia or, one particular country in Asia or Canada or what have you, those are difficult questions. But in many ways, the type of crises in my life make it more likely that I'm going to do that kind of work. The fact, like, for example, if I had a successful career as an architect, I couldn't do that. If I had decided to become a lawyer in Taiwan, I couldn't do that. And I would be spending years and years getting a law degree and so on, and then trying to earn enough money to justify again the years spent getting the law degree. The very peculiar path I've been forced onto in life makes it much more likely that I will set up and run a charity at some point. And apart from that's talking about a permanent charity, a permanent foundation, which I say still is likely in the future. But before then, obviously, I might also do fundraising for a specific project. So as vegans, a specific project can be helping one elephant, can be helping one monkey. It could be something very, very specific like that. But I can imagine doing, fundraising for a specific event, for a specific action in the future. But that's not what we're doing right now. Hopefully what we're doing here on Patreon is really creating a wonderful crossroads for you guys to meet and interact with one another, for you guys to stay in touch with me. And I hope it can inspire a lot of positive activity. And also, of course, I hope it's entertaining and interesting for you guys to hear the sound of my voice right now and what have you. And for $1 a month, I hope that you guys do feel it's worth your time and it's worth your money. It's very easy for me to put myself in your shoes. I know the type of content I would be looking up for on the internet myself. And, it's hard to see how this could go wrong. Let's put it that way. All right, I got so I guess this is question 1. There's a comment you guys might have missed from Alina. So I have a user who's using the name Alina who writes that she lives in a non-democratic state, the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. And she reflects on the lessons she's drawn from my recent videos, including my long interview with an 18-year-old new vegan activist. You guys may or may not have seen. The full recording for that is about an hour and 15 minutes long, with a young woman who just became vegan a few months ago and wanted to talk to me about effective activism for veganism in Canada. But anyway, this patron, Alina is writing about her own experience in the United Arab Emirates, which is not a democracy, and that she has to think very carefully about the type of activism to engage in, because any kind of street protest or aggressive approach will actually put people in prison. So this is rewarding for me again. I've had some fan mail recently from North Africa, from Muslim states in Northern Africa. I do know I have some Muslim viewers living in Muslim majority countries. And although, my channel doesn't cater to them, I think it's indicative of my, pragmatic, down-to-earth, real-world approach that the lessons I'm talking about learning from politics, they feel are applicable to their situations. Obviously, I think you can't say that for Durian Rider, and you can't say that for a group like Direct Action Everywhere. I think what they're saying, if you were watching in North Africa or the Emirates or what have you, you'd have to say, this is insane, this can't possibly work here. Now, I wrote a medium-length reply to Alina, which you guys can see on Patreon if you click around and find it. In broad brushstrokes, what I think is interesting here in this interaction is that fundamentally, the issues I'm discussing with Alina are the same as what I've been trying to alert people to in the Western world. Because they're asking the question of, how can we be effective as activists, as vegans, in pursuit of social change, how can we be effective given the cultural considerations that surround us, given the political context that surrounds us in a fairly deep sense? So I make some suggestions here. I did study the politics of the Muslim world when I was in university. I have some knowledge on paper about the politics of that part of the world, and it continues to enrich my life, my studies in that area. But I've never lived in a Muslim majority country. It's not my personal area of interest or expertise. Nevertheless, I have mentioned that a few times on my YouTube channel. I do take politics in that part of the world seriously, and really having a deep sense of comparative political analysis is an important part of what I do. When I look at political problems in Cambodia, I can appreciate that as bad as they may be, they're still very different from political problems in Indonesia right next door. And many, many people, again, I mostly deal with left-wing people, but left-wing people often show up and want to intervene in these situations, and they're not even going through the step of an analysis that says, well, this is bad, but is it as bad as what's happening in the country next door? How can we understand this in a kind of comparative context? And, obviously, I'm not saying that all interventions are wrong or misguided, but it's very easy to become hysterical about a political situation. In the strictest sense, you lose a sense of perspective if you don't evaluate a situation in its context that way, including comparative evaluation. So the suggestions I made here for a Muslim cultural context, I point out the significance of institution building and charity building. So obviously it relates to what I was just talking about in my own life, possibility of making a foundation, and pointing out that in a non-democratic Muslim majority context, you do still have the freedom to own and operate a restaurant. Most Muslim countries do. If you're in a Muslim country that tolerates a Chinese restaurant and that allows a Chinese restaurant to have Buddhist imagery inside the Chinese restaurant, not all Muslim states do. In some, that's illegal, like to have a statue of the Buddha inside a Chinese restaurant. But if you have that much freedom, then you actually already have the real possibility of a form of very effective activism in building restaurants. And the Muslim countries, to generalize, they tend to have a very positive view of certain types of charity. Zakat-style charity. So, you could have a vegan foundation that is giving alms to the poor, that is feeding poor people, or that's engaged in other traditionally acceptable forms of Muslim charity, but where that charity is vegan, where implicitly or educationally you're not just feeding the poor, you're maybe also trying to teach the poor how to feed themselves, and you're making a point about your charity not killing animals or what have you in passing. If you can package that in a way that's politically acceptable and that resonates culturally, that's meaningful in a Muslim cultural context, that's going to be much more powerful than just expressing your outrage or street protests. And again, it's even more of a problem because if the street protests put you in prison, you're not accomplishing anything by going to prison. Anyway, there are a few other examples there in that reply where I asked the question of what kind of charity might be effective. There certainly would be the possibility within a Muslim state to address things like heart attacks and cancer, to have a health-based approach where you're educating people on how to cope with these things. And again, it's easy for me to imagine how you can package that in an acceptable form for a Muslim society. If you're also against alcohol and against cigarettes, you could present that in a way where veganism is one component of it, but where you're not directly challenging the political status quo. But as I said at the start of this, in broad brushstrokes, what I'm discussing here with Astrid, I'm sorry, I read the wrong name. What I'm discussing here with Elena, it really is the same set of questions that I've been challenging my viewers with for many, many months. Months ago, I had videos addressing the group Direct Action Everywhere in a decadent Western democratic setting, where I'm really asking the question, is outrage effective as the core of activism? Is that the way we really would want to broach these issues? Is that really the way to speak to either a broad audience of the public or any specific segment? What really are the outcomes? Again, questioning cultural context, legal and political context, questioning what are the better alternatives in a democratic society to have meaningful outcomes. But also I'm questioning, who are you? You as an individual. If you are an architect, you probably have a better option than running into a restaurant and screaming at people, or running into a butcher shop and screaming at people. And Direct Action Everywhere, their core method during the last several years has been running into those places and screaming, "It's not food, it's violence," etc. Other slogans, and really including screaming and weeping in a very emotional way, a very incoherent emotional form. And you can see they have their own videos that demonstrate this, where they show their leaders weeping and screaming at strangers and so on. Now, okay, you guys already know where I stand on that. But already in the Western context, questioning the politics of outrage, questioning outrage as an effective mode of pursuing social change. And then saying, but who are you? If you are an architect, you have something better to do with your time. You have other talents. You probably, for one thing, don't have that much time to waste, but you have other avenues to pursue social change in a Western democracy, or even in the United Arab Emirates, frankly. Architects are not necessarily brilliant. You can meet some architects who are complete idiots. I've met some architects who are not very bright. But I'll tell you one thing. If you're an architect, you know how to draw. You have drafting skills. You almost certainly have access to an office that can print large, full-color posters. Architects both use, plotter printers to do graphic design, but, a part of architecture isn't just the actual planning of the building. You often have to present to clients visualizations. This is what it will look like when it's complete. So, glossy, full-color illustrations are an important part of what architecture firms do these days. As you might guess, I do have some experience of this in my own professional work. Right away, just within an architect's own office, what he could do to positively impact veganism, ecology, animal rights, I can think of a lot of things, even if the guy is not particularly bright, just given the artistic aspects of architecture. Now, hopefully, if someone's an architect, we also assume they're literate. They're definitely at a higher level of literacy than someone like Durian Rider. Probably they can put together information or do original research. Probably they can be involved in some form of legal advocacy, of lobbying government. Probably there's a lot more they can do. And as you've also heard me say on my YouTube channel, this does not mean that I think there's no role whatsoever for street protests. I think we have to think about street protests as a rally, as a way of rewarding people who already are vegan, and even then it's probably not the best way. But really, we have to be at peace with the fact that vegans want all the same things normal people want out of life. Boyfriends want to find girlfriends. Girlfriends want to find boyfriends. People want to meet each other and be sociable, and they want to break the isolation of being vegan and deal with the agony and the struggle of it all. And there is a real role for the social elements of protest. But at the same time, of course, I'm warning against this becoming an end in itself. And definitely for many, many, many vegans of many different political stripes, this has been distorted as if street protest is the only method of pursuing political change. And there's no respectable way to come to that conclusion in terms of learning the lessons from history. And when you talk to someone like Elena here in the United Arab Emirates, or you're looking at China or Cambodia or any other place that has, shall we say, limited democracy, many of those issues are again put into a very interesting contrast, because suddenly the stakes are higher. Going to jail is no joke, and it's really worth wondering, are you making a positive change on the steps that lead to your going to jail? Okay, next question. Astrid writes in. Astrid says, apologies if I missed a video of yours. you've talked about the benefits of being in a democracy when it comes to trying to make change, and obviously the benefits of living in a democratic country compared to the dictatorships of the world. But what are your personal views on the morality of democracy? Her question goes on to reflect a little bit further. So that's the end of the question. Astrid, the core of her question is, what are your personal views on the morality of democracy? Well, my engagement with these issues is fairly deep. I do think, first and foremost, of ancient writers like Thucydides, Aristotle, etc., the ancient Greek discourse on democracy. That is not idealistic. If you actually read Thucydides, he is a very harsh critic of democracy, including the tendency of democracy to start wars. Another famous voice in that discourse, who does not mean anything to me personally, I don't feel a connection, John Stuart Mill is another great critic of democracy, where he does illustrate the value of democracy. But, John Stuart Mill was actually very concerned about the oppression of minorities. When you had majority rule, one of the negative aspects of that is the bullying of and the suppression of minority peoples within that country. Now, that's interesting because, of course, John Stuart Mill's own experience was primarily in England and secondarily with India. He actually devoted a lot of his time to advocating for human rights in India, we would say. I'm simplifying, just say human rights in India. Obviously, two completely different contexts, the British Empire of recent centuries as opposed to ancient Greece. But I mean, I say this in preamble. My personal views on the morality of democracy do not hinge on specific anecdotal problems that just happen to come up in the newspaper this month. They do stretch back over thousands of years and are based on drawing lessons from somewhat terrible chapters of the history of the world. I try to be very honest with myself about the immoral aspects of democracy. Democracy has a funny tendency of starting wars. Democracy has a terrible tendency to be unstable, to be fleeting. And I think what most people ignore today in 2016, democracy also can fail. And the failure is not always dramatic. It's not always like Cambodia collapsing into sort of genocide. Today, in 2016, I think it's quite fair to say that Mexico is a failure of democracy. When you read about a town in Mexico where the mayor is assassinated, and then they try to elect another mayor, and that mayor is also assassinated because local, drug cartels, local drug dealing gangs control that town, and where there are no police and no law. Mexico is not a dramatic failure of democracy. It hasn't collapsed into a genocide or civil war. But nevertheless, Mexico, I would say, is a failed democracy. And obviously there's a large literature written by specialists about that. And Mexico is really a very important example to consider. For one thing, it's literally next door to the United States. It's not Muslim, it's Catholic. It doesn't have problems with mass illiteracy or many of the other excuses for the failures of democracy. In many, many ways, Mexico has benefited from neoliberalism in recent decades. Economically, Mexico has been through a period of rapid improvement, not a period of collapse or declining standards of living or what have you, but nevertheless, it's a failure. So that's really a very grave warning about the fragility of democracy, and I think it's fair to say everyone just wants to ignore it. And nobody is comfortable really paying attention to and learning from the failure of democracy in Mexico. It might be an exaggeration to say the same about recent failings of democracy in Greece or what have you. To give one example in terms of what I regard as immoral in democracy. So because the question uses some interesting phrasing here. It says, you reflect that democracy is in some ways fundamentally based on and perpetuated by some evils. That is true. So to give you an example, I do believe that discrimination against people based on their ability to pay is evil in the following sense. You have a university, a certain number of people get to study architecture, staying with the same example, and other people are going to get kicked out or refused. I think it is completely immoral to choose who will become an architect based on their ability to pay. So that is a separate question from whether or not the university costs money. Like, if the tuition is $5,000, if it costs $5,000, that's one thing. But are you admitted or not admitted? Do you have the opportunity based on your ability to pay, based on the money you already have? It's quite possible to have a situation where poor people are admitted and their payment is deferred, that it's delayed. They say, okay, well, 10 years from now, you got to pay back the tuition. There are many, many ways to cope with tuition fees in different countries around the world. But my point is that is a fundamental form of discrimination that I believe is immoral. And the democratic society I live in is completely skewed by that bias. Now, again, within Canada has some elements of socialism. They're pretty crappy. Nobody looks at Canada as a great positive example of a successful country, neither in terms of democracy nor in terms of social services. But many people, including Americans, exaggerate the supposed socialism of our healthcare system. I would say, again, regardless of the price, it is deeply immoral from my perspective for access to medical care to be based on your ability to pay. So you have two people who both need a cancer operation. Who gets the operation? If it's only the person who can pay for it, or if it goes first to the person who can pay for it, and the second person has to wait longer, maybe die of cancer because their operation is delayed, that to me is fundamentally immoral. Now, ironically, within Canada, we have a different social system in each province. Each province has its own healthcare system and its own laws governing these things. But sometimes the provinces that have the best medical system have the most immoral medical system by this criterion. So the province of Quebec, it may have the best quality of hospitals, the best quality of medical care in Canada, but they absolutely have a two-track system or two-tier system this way, where the system has basically been corrupted by cash services. They have both a socialist system and they have a fee-for-service system competing with each other within the province in a very strange legal gray area that the government tends to flip-flop on and people tend to be in denial about. So to me, again, I live in a society where these questions never get asked and never get answered. It is totally immoral to operate a prison on a for-profit basis, in my opinion. I do not see how any democracy can justify that. I'll just mention, I do believe prisons should exist. There are people who idealistically claim that all prisons should be abolished. There should be no prisons in the world. I don't believe that. However, the concept of running a prison as a business on a for-profit basis is, to me, fundamentally and intrinsically immoral. And now within that, talking about the prisons and correction service, the idea that someone will get better treatment based on their ability to pay. So to me, that's a deep evil. That's completely evil and completely unacceptable. I don't think you should have a better lawyer, a better trial, a better outcome, or that you should go to a better prison because you're wealthy. To me, this is completely undemocratic, completely immoral. And yet the majority of democracies in the world accept these things without any hesitation. So now my final point under this heading, why is it that access to the political system itself is based on the ability to pay? To me, this is completely immoral, completely unforgivable. Why is it that I can't talk to the mayor or I can't talk to my member of parliament? In the United States, you can't talk to your congressman. Why is it that my ability to have a voice in government is actually based on my ability to pay? Why is it that my access to the law itself requires thousands and thousands of dollars to go to a lawyer? It's a problem so obvious that nobody wants to address it. Both getting a lawyer and getting time in court and getting your voice heard. again, this isn't just Canada, the United States. This is also true of France, England, what have you. Your ability to contest these things is based on your ability to pay. So, to me, I mean, obviously, anyone can think of a better way to organize all of these issues. But this has become an unquestioned assumption about how Western democracy operates. And really, it has nothing to do with capitalism. It has nothing to do with socialism. It has nothing to do with anything else. It's a fundamental core question of democracy. Right now, my ability even to have my divorce relies on my paying thousands and thousands of dollars to a lawyer. My divorce, admittedly, is a private matter. But if I want to challenge the fact that a factory is polluting a river, if I know that, if I can prove that in a court of law, why is it impossible for me to have a voice? The factory owner has a voice because he has money. So he has access to parliament, he has access to lawyers. What about me? Why is it that I have to do fundraising and get donations, which is very hard to do, to raise thousands of dollars to give to a lawyer so that I can challenge that, so I can debate that? That was unthinkable to Aristotle, to Thucydides and the theoreticians of ancient Athens. Even though Athens had its own contradictions, obviously, slave-owning society and extremely unequal, their assumption that you could just show up and talk to the government was very deep. Their idea of what a trial was, their idea of what an election was profoundly different. If you actually read Aristotle's Constitution of Athens, you will find a very interesting critique of voting itself. Aristotle did not believe in electing people through voting. Very, very interesting. But I leave that aside. So, Astrid, there are some thoughts in response to your thoughtful question. So that was a question from Astrid. My next question is from Alexa Aretz. She asks, hip-hop recommendations / playlist. So this is good. I'm trying to lighten the tone slightly, I guess. I would say in general, if you're downloading hip-hop from the internet, Raekwon is somewhat underrated. Raekwon is one of the members of the Wu-Tang Clan, and although he's associated with his early period was when he was on the radio, was more popular, he really continued to consistently put out mixtapes for free. So apart from his albums, a very long list. If you go to Wikipedia, get discography for Raekwon, you can get a pretty impressive list of legally free to download mixtapes that Raekwon continued to produce throughout his whole career. I don't know. I could say more about hip-hop. Lately, I've been listening a lot to an obscure mixtape from Ghostface called Put It On The Line. That's a little bit older. As those two examples already mentioned, a lot of my own engagement with hip-hop is shaped around Wu-Tang Clan, that era and that subgenre of rap music. Not sure how much I should say. In terms of the younger generation, Lil B, all of his music is free. You do have to, a lot of it is garbage, but, given that it's free anyway, if you want a Lil B mixtape that's maybe a good representation of his work, he has one called God's Father. The God's Father mixtape. Again, you can download that for free. There are at least 4 or 5 good tracks on that. Many of them are bad, but you delete them. This is really the era of free music. In general, as my life progressed, around the time when I was a university student myself, so let's say around 1999, the only music I listened to was, on the one hand, hip-hop, and on the other hand, Johann Sebastian Bach, like a certain type of classical music that was very mathematical and structured. And then when I'd heard all the songs I liked by Bach 1,000 times, I stopped listening to classical music, and then it was just rap music. It was just hip-hop. So now rap music is really the only music I listen to. I assumed that I would stop listening to rap music when my daughter was born, and I was really working and living as a full-time father. However, as you guys know, I now see my daughter so rarely that I do listen to rap music when my daughter is not around, and she's not around most of the time. So anyway, I guess feel free to ask more questions if you want to know. Maybe this is boring for the rest of my listeners, so I'm going to move on. Okay, Genevieve Gabrielle. She asks, Eisel, do you think it is important for vegans to stay on social media like Facebook? Does it make a difference? I think it does, but maybe I am deluding myself. Close quote. Okay, I like to keep it real. Not being on social media is a luxury. I wish my life was so meaningful and so busy that I had no reason to use social media. I wish I knew so many vegan activists that I had no reason to contribute to YouTube or to talk to you people on video. That would be wonderful. Can you imagine if I was living in a situation where I was getting so much done in terms of real-world activism that there was just no point in engaging in social media or internet activism? I can imagine that. It's extremely unlikely to happen. So, I just say, I do not regard social media as a luxury. I regard not being on social media as a luxury. If you can exclude it from your life, if you can avoid it or you can minimize it, then probably there are a lot of other things going well in your life. And then that's a luxury you can afford. In a recent video, I reflected on YouTube that if I had taken all of this time that I put into YouTube and instead put it into meeting up with the same vegans here in Victoria, several of whom really dislike me, and not all of them, but several of them do, it would have accomplished nothing. It would have been a complete waste of my time. I think I went to just enough events here to recognize that I was wasting my time. And I've actually just recently gotten some fan mail from other vegans here in Victoria who never met me. And they also were writing to me saying, they really appreciate my YouTube channel and that they also are a bit shocked at what's going on in the local vegan scene here. But, for myself, back when I was living a much more meaningful life in some ways, when I was really engaged with what was going on around me in Laos, I wasn't on social media at all. And I was very, very careful with my web presence and with what articles I put online. I did publish some articles on the internet because the politics was in the real world and in my face and what have you. And it would be wonderful to imagine that one day in the future I would be so busy with, making a meaningful difference directly in the real world that I would be contributing less and less to the internet. That would be very positive. But it's unlikely. So in my own life now, you guys know what's up with me. I think I might be putting more time into YouTube, more time into the internet, because the rest of my life is going to be pretty meaningless being bogged down with schoolwork, both as a student and as a teacher in China. And I'll be very isolated from and alienated from anyone with really common interests, common passions with myself. And I think that's true for the majority of vegans right now in 2016. The most common thing I hear from vegans on the internet is that they do not know any other vegans in real life. So that's why they're on the internet. But if they were, again, we all use this word community when there really is no community for vegans, not online and not anywhere in the real world, so far as I can see, with possible exceptions like Taiwan, if you want to talk about Buddhist vegans in Taiwan, etc. I think for any of us, if we had a real community, that would be the point at which you could stop wasting time on social media. And okay, I'm keeping it all the way real. Some of the time I spend on social media I regret, and it hurts me emotionally, and it feels like a waste, but like I feel ethically I have to do it anyway. I just spent some time yesterday sending some messages to complete strangers on the internet who were vegan, writing them because they were vegan, saying, hi, I'm on my way to Thailand, do you want to meet up? Because I'm passing through Thailand on my way from Canada to China. At this stage of my life, it feels bad. And I've done that for so many years. And it brings back the memory of so many efforts to make friends or just introduce myself, to make connections with other people because they're vegan, to build on common ground. And where it ends badly or it starts badly or just you never get any reply. Putting yourself out there, making yourself available emotionally to try to connect with strangers, to try to have those meaningful connections to social media. Sometimes it does hurt me, and it does feel exhausting, and it does feel like a waste of time. And I think a lot of people end up embittered and stop doing that, and even stop replying when other people write to them, when it's someone else trying to initiate and trying to make that connection. I think the truth is, as a character, I am not embittered by the experiences I've had. I've had horrible, terrible experiences. I have not let them embitter me. And there's both good and bad to that. The negative aspect is that I'm still really suffering. I'm still really feeling this stuff as it happens. If you're embittered, if you're jaded, if you're closed off from those feelings and emotions, then by the same token, you're not suffering in the same way. I still am really trying to make new connections, like a teenager. I'd say like a teenager who's just transferred to a new school. That's my situation in life. You're the new kid in the high school. Everyone else has friends. You don't have any friends because you just moved to this town, as a teenager. That's my situation again and again. And now I'm moving to China, and it's going to be that way again. Both on the internet and in real life, I'm in that vulnerable situation. And I do get hurt, and I do suffer. But that process of perpetual suffering is preferable to being jaded, to being unfeeling, to being closed off from new experience. So that's as real as it gets, Jenny. That's my response to your question. She also asks, what is your favorite thing to eat in China? I am actually going to dodge that question by mentioning a food you guys won't have heard about. They're one of the only vegan foods that's really a native indigenous vegan food in northern Thailand and Laos, both countries, northern Thailand and Laos, is called Khao Lam. I'll post a link because you'll never guess how to spell it. But Khao Lam is a method they have of taking fresh cut bamboo and putting rice inside of it. And they will normally chop up some kind of local potato, such as the taro or another tuber. And then sometimes they'll add some coconut fat, some bits of coconut or something else. There are different recipes in different regions, different traditions. They often add some purple rice, which is called king's rice, so that the whole thing is purple when you eat it. And they roast it on an open fire, and the taste of the smoke gets into it and so on. And not only is it vegan, it's actually pretty close to antiseptic. In a country where most of the food is filthy and can carry disease, this whole thing is kind of boiled from the inside out, and you break off the bits of bamboo. You peel back the bamboo layer, and then you get to eat the rice and other ingredients that are inside, rice and bits of potato. So that is actually healthy. It's actually safe, and the vast majority of white people do not know that exists. I can remember, again, in terms of just reflecting on this, I'm not a loner by nature. I remember I took a long bus trip going through Thailand and Laos, one day where the bus takes hours and hours and hours. And I made friends with like 15 people on that bus trip. Obviously it's not a deep friendship, but you have several hours together talking. And so, these guys were all talking with me and they were friends with me, by the end of the trip. And I remember they were terrified to try Khao Lam. There was a very disconsolate young woman trying to sell Khao Lam out of a basket. And I could speak Lao, so I shouted out to the window to her. She was shocked to see a white man speaking Lao as fluently as I could back then. I now haven't really spoken these languages for 10 years. But I called out the window to her, and I was speaking to her in Lao. And, she brightened up so much. You could see she was really hurt and depressed. She's a very poor person, obviously. And she was trying to make money selling this food, Khao Lam, to foreigners in buses. And in theory, she could have sold some to truck drivers. But nobody was buying it because they didn't even know what it was. It looks like she's selling bamboo sticks. They don't know what it is. And I remember trying to encourage the other people on the bus to try this exotic food that is vegan. Anyway, it made her day that I spoke to her in Lao, and I bought several and gave them to other people on the bus for free. And they were still really afraid to eat it until I ate it in front of them and so on. And then they were all delighted and thought it was delicious. Anyway, I mentioned this as another example. I'm not a loner. I don't have a problem making friends. Everywhere I go, I am sociable and I meet people and so on. You guys have some sense of my character on YouTube. I also am not a nice guy. It's something else I've talked about on YouTube and I'll talk about again. But, you have those kinds of experiences again and again. And as I say, for me, my situation still is that I'm the new kid at the high school, and I'm still having to move to a new town, start again with nothing but a backpack, and really having no friends in this world. So hopefully over the long term, my internet presence has some positive effect on my life in that respect too. It would be great if now, when going to China, there was one person in China who knew me from YouTube, or one person in Thailand, or what have you. That'd be great. Next question is from Mike on Raw. So if you guys have seen, just yesterday night, I uploaded a video giving a shout out to Mike on Raw and responding to another issue from his YouTube channel. Mike asks, could you discuss what you have found are the pieces necessary for a movement to have success? You have talked about things that won't work on their own, and you have talked about how political influence at all levels is important. But can political influence create success on its own? What are the critical parts? Okay, close quote, end of question. So obviously this could be a 1-hour monologue in response to this, given my background and my interest in life. To give a somewhat limited reflection in just 2 parts. One, the most successful political movements are the most invisible. So in this I mentioned, in a recent video, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. The campaigns to address and indeed demonize, drunk driving. Like scientifically, it's actually possible for a person to drink alcohol and drive a car in a completely responsible and safe way. Politically, that's an inconvenient fact, but we have set up laws that make it completely illegal for anyone to drink alcohol and drive a car. And I agree with that. I mean, that's the only way you have to have a law that applies to everyone equally. You can't have a law that says, well, if you're really good at driving drunk, we'll let you do it. But, over a period of decades, the crusades against drunk driving and the crusades to really kind of limit the culture of alcohol have been very, very successful. And they're also largely invisible. Now, at the opposite extreme, another example I talked about in a recent video was the question of the conspiracy for who killed JFK. This type of conspiratorial movement for political change. And, of course, lobbies that are paid for by industries, what have you. There are many political movements that in this sense also are invisible. Why do I mention this? Well, for one thing, the success of Mothers Against Drunk Driving is not unique. They don't have any special advantages. Their methods and their successes can be reproduced, can be imitated, can be learned from. And by contrast, some vegans want to draw attention to the abolition of slavery, specifically the abolition of slavery in Georgia, in the United States, in the southern United States. And many aspects of that are unique and cannot be reproduced. The liberation of slaves in Haiti, fascinating history that I myself have read a great deal about. But there's no way I can say, oh yeah, look at the situation for slaves in Haiti several hundred years ago, and now obviously we can just apply these lessons to Canada in 2016. No, you have to be able to recognize when something is comparable, when it's reproducible, when it is something you can generalize about, and when really it's quite unique. Now, I mean, in Haiti, the revolution that freed the slaves involved real violence of the most gruesome kind, of course, including tremendous violence by the white people on behalf of the slave owners. But the slaves themselves, it was said at the time, and not without reason, the flag of the revolution was of a white baby impaled on a spike, because the slaves would kill the slave masters, and they would routinely take a spear and murder the babies, murder the infants of the slave masters, and then march to the next town with a spear with a dead baby at the end of it. Now, I mention this it's an incredibly gory chapter of history, but let's keep it real. When other vegans talk about using slavery, the abolition of slavery as a model for social change for veganism, is that really what you're talking about, homeboy? I don't think so. I don't think at all we're really talking about a situation where you want to emulate that type of violent social change. And now, obviously, I mean, most people who really study that history, they have mixed sympathies because, of course, slavery is bad. They want to see slavery end, but they understand why the extreme violence happened. It's tragic. But learning from that tragedy and what lessons you apply now, especially in a democratic society where you can go to City Hall, you can collect donations and hire a lawyer and challenge these things in a court of law. The slaves in Haiti couldn't do that. When there are so many politicians open to us, that's really worth challenging. And as I say, so the real contrast I'm making is between this idea I'm putting forward that the most successful political movements are the most invisible, and then on the other hand, people tend to think that the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So that's an idiom. That's a sort of childhood idiom we have in English. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. The point of that phrase is to say that complaining gets results. Street protests, complaining being the squeaky wheel. No, I don't think that gets results. I think, again, whether you look at Mothers Against Drunk Driving or any other, again, campaigns against smoking cigarettes to reform, labeling and health standards for cigarettes, et cetera, those are the most successful and they're also the most invisible. And the culture of complaint is not really the culture you want to be imitating. Although, again, as I've said earlier in this same podcast, I do have sympathy with the social reasons for why people want to organize rallies and protests, and I don't regard them as completely worthless. Coming back to Mike's question here, part 2, the second aspect I wanted to mention. If you're really asking the question, what is the critical aspect? The critical aspect is money. Okay, the critical issue is economic. Why is PETA the most powerful voice for veganism in the world today? People for the ethical treatment of animals. Not because they're smart, not because they're right, not because they're good at what they do, because they got money. Okay, they pay wages. They employ people. All right? I hear a lot of BS about being a full-time activist on the internet. The employees of PETA are probably the only full-time vegan activists in the world. They're the majority of them. How many vegan agencies can you say employ people? Now, you guys know, if you watch my channel, I don't like PETA. There are a lot of things I dislike about them. I think they're kind of dumb and they're kind of goofy, and they've been on the wrong side of history on a number of different issues. It's not perfect. Most vegans, of course, hate them because they kill stray animals, or they hate them because they have posters with naked women in them, et cetera, et cetera. But guess what? At the end of the day, money talks. You can refer to the first or the second question I answered, where I talked about the fact that I deeply disagree with this, that in a democratic society, freedom of speech should not be based on the ability to pay. But in answer to this question, that is the answer. Now, you've heard me say on YouTube, I had this experience with the Green Party in Canada. I could also talk about my experience with Buddhism. Both of those examples, what really mattered was motivating elderly people to support you. So if you have highly motivated retired people older than 65, who are giving you $100 a month, so there could be elderly Chinese people who give money to a Buddhist temple, could be elderly white people who give money to the Green Party, whatever. That forms the economic basis for a successful political movement. That is the brutal, ugly truth. Nobody else is going to tell you, Mike. Yes, the foundation for a successful political movement is financial. And the foundation for those finances, in my opinion, is transparency and accountability. Right? And transparency does not mean democracy. So, like, those Chinese people, when they donate their money to the Buddhist temple, they may have no control over what happens to that money. They don't get to vote. They don't get a referendum. They don't even get a debate or discussion. But what they will get, if it's a good Buddhist temple, is a report telling them what happened to the money. And then, of course, they can decide in the next year if they want to donate again or not. They might cancel their donation. So, okay, so much money went into repainting the roof, so much money did this, so much money did that. And, it may be, of course, that some of the money is being spent to take care of orphans, to give food to starving people. Actually, some Buddhist temples do animal rights stuff also to liberate animals from cages and this kind of thing. That's another story. That could be a 1-hour discussion right there. But you add it all up and you give them a list, and even in the complete absence of democracy, that can be a very powerful and meaningful thing. That's the complete answer to your question for the purposes of this podcast, Mike. Obviously, I could speak about it at even greater length. Yeah, the foundation is financial and economic. The foundation for that has to do with trust, with credibility, with legitimacy. And the foundation for that, in turn, is transparency and accountability. That's the essence of the thing. And the most successful movements are the most invisible. It's not the case that the squeaky wheel gets the grease. It's a misconception. I've got a question coming in from two of my longtime viewers here, Eva and Haruki. They ask, Haruki and I were wondering what would be your favorite or most memorable books you read so far, both fiction and nonfiction, and for what reasons? So I'll give a two-part answer, one on fiction and one on nonfiction. I have read incredibly little fiction in my adult life, incredibly little. The most of the fiction I have read as an adult has been for historical reasons. So when I'm reading Buddhist philosophy, I don't consider that fiction. In a sense, some of it is fiction. If you're studying ancient Buddhist philosophy, that to me is not what we normally consider fiction. It's not like reading a novel. That's really study or research or what have you. Something I may return to reading here, you really need to have a certain kind of mentality for it. The original novels for The Water Margin, I know that's a very strange title, The Water Margin, is a very strange reflection on the history of China. That's a fictional work, but again, I'm reading it for nonfiction reasons. And it's much misunderstood. It's been made into many, many kung fu movies, and it's often presented as a sort of Robin Hood-style adventure of heroes. But really, the book is very political. It's published in 4 volumes in English translation by Sidney Shapiro. In the future, there will be better translations. It's not a great English translation, but it's okay. But politically, there are many, many reflections on how the court system worked, on justice and injustice, on how the political system worked. It manages to be somewhat entertaining, but the tone of condemnation is consistent throughout. And one of the strangest things, when that book is adapted into a modern movie or modern cartoon, because it has been many times, they turn almost all of the villains into heroes. But really, that book is presenting most of the major characters as villains. And that it's a bizarre cultural transformation that tends to just get overlooked, where they're sort of made into fun-loving good guys. But in the original book, it's the crimes they commit are taken very seriously. And I just give you one example from that story. There's a guy who's guilty of murder, and through complete financial corruption, he really escapes punishment. Rather than being in prison, it's so corrupt that he's paid bribes to the prison wardens. So he's allowed, while other people in the prison are being tortured and other people in the prison are having to work on a farm in a sort of slavery situation, he's allowed to stroll out of the prison, go down the road, sit in a restaurant overlooking the river, and get drunk and eat food at this restaurant. And in the story, he doesn't appreciate this at all. He doesn't feel privileged. He doesn't. It depicts him as being completely self-righteous, haughty, contemptuous, and totally self-pitying, totally preoccupied with how difficult his life is, even though the book has just described to you him walking past people who are being tortured, who are being whipped and working in the fields or whatever. And the reader is really told this guy is guilty of murder, and there's no justification for it. It's not a morally gray area, the murder. He's a bad guy. This is sort of confronting the audience in its own time as a very biting satire. But somehow people read that and they see these characters as heroes, or they manage to miss the point. But really, that's a very dark cross-section of Chinese society, pre-modern Chinese society. The only book of contemporary fiction that I have read in 15 years is the series Game of Thrones. The series is called A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. The TV show Game of Thrones is now very famous. And again, what I'm interested in those books are really the reflections on political philosophy. They also have some political content in them. But in terms of fiction, really, for like 15 years, that's it. That's the only thing I've read. It's interesting for me to reflect. Within Game of Thrones, I really can't relate to the stuff that's about childhood. That's about, from the perspective of the very young characters. I'm not interested in the kind of teenage romance elements that are there, because some of the storylines have romance between young people. But a lot of the scenes where it's kind of mean old men sitting around a table talking about war and politics, there's a lot that I do relate to. And some of the lines that are very simple and very throwaway have really stayed with me. There's one scene where a child is questioning a much older man about a battle that's just happened. He's saying, why did you fight these people? Why did you kill these people? And the answer that comes from the older man, and this is to a child, a real child, he just says, they were foes. And the reason why that has an impact on me as a reader is that those novels, they really do take the time to talk about the complex, morally murky political situation that surrounds those types of episodes. But then in the core of that, you have these, terrible simplicities. What's the answer to that question? Why did you guys just have to fight to the death with swords? And it's not being glorified. It's not being presented as something fun or adventuresome or exciting. It's presented as this brutal, feudal dystopia. But at the end of the day, what can you say to a child? They were foes, So there are reflections of that kind in that series that I do value and that do stay with me. So then in the nonfiction category, I'll just give a brief shout out to Thucydides. So among the ancient Greeks, Thucydides has a very moving and jarring critique of democracy that at the same time describes for you how democracy worked in ancient Athens. There is an edited version of Thucydides' great work, his main opus, that is under the title On Justice, Power, and Human Nature. So that's the title given to a compressed version, a set of excerpts from Thucydides in English. So it's a much shorter book. But if you can't spell Thucydides and you just want to Google that, so Google Ancient Greece on Justice, Power, and Human Nature, and you should find the version of the book I'm alluding to. I can't say Thucydides is a book that changed my life because I read it relatively late in life, but it's a book I deeply appreciate, and I have commented on my YouTube channel before. Okay, next question. Scarlett Gone Raw asks, okay, so now we're getting into more autobiographical stuff here. Why the enormous sacrifice to teach in China, she asks. I understand your passion is in Asian studies and politics, but to be so separated from personal freedoms, liberties, and sorry to mention your ongoing precarious situation with your wife involving your daughter, I can't help but speculate that it's not the right timing for this intellectual opportunity. So pause there. The question actually goes on. Well, the timing is peculiar and it's forced by a number of factors. My lawyer tells me I've got something like 18 months before there's any progress with the divorce. It seems to me possible that something will happen about 10 months from now at the soonest. Something. But the French legal system, in case you haven't heard, is not quick. So my whole situation with my wife and daughter, so far as I know, based on the information I have, including most of all the information from my lawyer, is that it's in suspended animation, is that nothing is going to change for 1 year. My situation at the university here in Canada is another reason why I have to do this now and not later. My situation with my career and needing to earn a living is yet another reason. There are several different factors forcing it to be now and not later. But if I stayed here in Canada, I would actually be in a worse circumstance for seeing my daughter, not better. So I know that sounds strange, but it's true. Now, among the things I did, you've recently seen the video where I reflect on the horrible ways in which my wife really has harmed me. Despite that, as soon as I had the plan in place to move to Kunming, China, I wrote to my wife and invited her to come and visit me there. She could bring my daughter, or she could leave my daughter behind. So my ex-wife, for her, Yunnan is the province in China, and Kunming is the city. That's really the center of the world for my ex-wife. Her research, her area of expertise, that's really the core of her own area of interest. And that's where we met. We met in Yunnan, and we lived there together, 8 years ago or something now, a long time ago. And it's a very meaningful opportunity for her to come and spend time in Kunming. So I knew there would be a good chance that she and my daughter would actually come to join me there temporarily or possibly for a few months or what have you. It also, as I said, Kunming, it isn't any closer or further away from France than Canada is. I'm on the west coast of Canada. It's an amazing distance from France. If you're on the east coast of Canada, it might not be that bad. But moving from here to Kunming in these circumstances does not put me at any disadvantage. So my wife actually is prevaricated in that. I knew that would actually be a very tempting opportunity for her to come to China once I was already set up in China. And at first she said no. And then later she actually wrote to me saying yes, that she would come to visit me and she would bring my daughter to Kunming. So we don't know if that's really going to happen. If you guys have watched that recent video, you'll know she she has a tendency to try to blackmail me or backstab me. And it's possible that just to hurt me, she would come to visit that part of China and still not allow me to see my daughter. That we'd be in the same city together and I would not be able to see my daughter. That's already what she did to me once in Europe. So there's no limit. As I've mentioned, also, it's possible she'll literally murder me. I mean, I wouldn't, it's possible, there's no limit to this. And I've sort of wondered why, given that she's already done these terrible things, given that you would lie to a court, that you'd lie to the cops, what won't you do? And there are many other ways she's harmed me that I haven't mentioned. Anyway, yeah. So it's a strange set of circumstances. I would just point out, this started by saying why the enormous sacrifice to go to China. Well, it's a sacrifice. I hope something positive comes out of it. Just a few months ago, I applied to join the Canadian Army, which would also be a huge sacrifice. Just a few months ago, I formally spoke to the Israeli embassy people about migrating to Israel, which would also be a huge sacrifice. So I've been looking at a whole lot of huge sacrifices, most of which offer nothing positive in my life, nothing positive for me or my daughter. Something positive could come out of this move to China, so we got to hope for the best. So the question goes on to just say, wouldn't it be better if you postponed this trip to China? No, I've got to get this done. I've got to finish my education. I've got to get a real job. I've got to get a real home, precisely so that everything's in order, so that I hope I can be a good father to my daughter whenever the divorce actually wraps up in court. And we don't know. It's certainly possible I'll be in a situation where I see my daughter, say, 3 months a year. That happens with divorces, It's possible I'll be in a situation where I see her every other weekend and we live in the same city. We don't know. But I'm going to be in some position of larger responsibility for my daughter in the next several years. I mean, at the absolute, I don't see how the French courts could take more than 2 years. But yeah, it could be still 18 months. So, which is very sad. All right, next question is from Julia Jansen. A question about your divorce videos. I'm sorry if I got anything wrong, but to me it sounds like from the time you and your ex-wife got together, you were suffering, and for you the relationship was bad. You said she always promised to change and that things would get better, but did you really marry a woman based on the promise that everything would get better? You seem so rational, and yet this decision sounds to me a bit naive. I'm just curious, what were your motives at the beginning of the relationship? So I'll start by saying, in answer to this question more generally, I'm not offended by these questions. It does not make me feel bad that people care, that people want to know about these aspects of the personal life. That's very positive from my perspective. Somehow below this audio file, I'll provide the links to the account I wrote. I have a written account of what happened with my divorce that's hidden on my blog. I say it's hidden because it's just not that easy to find. If you Google enough, you could find it eventually. For anyone who wants to know, I appreciate that you want to know. That's it. I mean, to me, it's completely positive. And I know exactly how it feels, by contrast, to be in the situation where nobody cares and nobody wants to know. So from my perspective, you guys can know as much as you want to. You've already heard me say in my recent YouTube video, sort of disclaimer or warning, that I do avoid saying anything critical about my ex-wife. I do avoid basically saying the bad things she did. So it is very flattering to my ex-wife, my mode of approaching this personal history. But as you know, also, I think that's for the best. But beyond that, I'm happy to have the question. I'm happy for you guys to read as much as you want to read or hear as much as you want to hear about it. And for some people, it's deeply meaningful. There are some people, for whatever reason, this resonates with them and it really matters to them a lot. But for other people, they just pay attention to it because they care about me. They're interested in who I am in my life. And of course, I value that even more. That's wonderful. So the specific question here, if you're asking, would you really marry a woman based on the promise that things would get better? Yes. Yeah. And of course, that's partly because my ex-wife has other redeeming qualities. My ex-wife is very smart and very hardworking. Those are things I value a lot. And when we first got together, she was very much in love with me. She was in love with me right to the end, too. I just say, even the day at the airport when we split up, the last thing she ever said to me was, "I still love you." She hasn't said that for a while now since then, as you might have guessed. No, but I mean, my ex-wife had a set of very obvious positive qualities that, in my mind, justified giving her a chance again and again to do the right thing. Now, this both is part of the beginning of the relationship and the end of the relationship. What I said at the very start of this long Q&A session about the value I place in democracy, this actually does have a real role in my relations with women and with my personal life. To me, it is inconceivable that I would be in a relationship with a woman where I make all the decisions or I take responsibility for things. I do approach all my personal relationships in a very sort of democratic way, which doesn't mean I take no responsibility. It doesn't mean you vote on everything. But on any given issue, you discuss, okay, is this your decision or is this my decision? What do you think? What do I think? Who's going to make the call? Who's going to do the work? Who's going to be responsible for what happens next? Where I don't just assume the woman in my life is involved in making those decisions. I really demand it. I demand that as equals, we're really involved in thinking about it and deciding things as they happen. Now, so at the beginning of that, obviously, this is part of why I valued her as a person. She was smart enough. She was, engaged with related issues in terms of her own research and scholarship. This obviously, for me, was the, enticing prospect of being in a relationship with someone who was my intellectual equal. However, as I say, this actually also foretells the end of the relationship, of why the marriage couldn't work anymore. The marriage could have continued if I had just become a tyrant. If I just said, look, you've destroyed your credibility. You don't get to make any decisions anymore. From now on, I'm the man in the relationship and I decide things. If I had taken that approach, the marriage could have lasted. But from my perspective, it wouldn't really be a marriage anymore. It would really be, it would be a very unequal. It would be some kind of 24-hour BDSM relationship or something. To me, this would not really be conceivable. So that's both the beginning and the end. I both expect and I demand to be in relationships with people whom I can treat as my equals, who I can debate things with as my equals, where I can share the decision-making responsibility with the other person or people as my equals, and where their opinion matters and so on, where it's not just me making decisions. But by the same token, when you're in a marriage like that and it falls apart, then you get to the point where it's like, well, you've harmed me, you've done these terrible things to me, you haven't apologized, you haven't said it's going to be better in the future, there's no way to make this work, and I can't relate to you like my slave. I either have to treat you, like my equal, or we have to split up. We have to be separate but equal, Maybe that's enough of a set of reflections in response to that question. All right. Marmar asked the question, I'd like to hear how your life aligns with atheism. What does it mean to you? You've mentioned in one of your videos that you consider yourself to be a nihilistic atheist. Can you go into more detail about that? Best of luck to you with your move and new chapter in your life. You've been through a lot in this experience we deem as life, but you keep on keeping on. You presume. You presume that I keep on keeping on, do you? Look, so atheism and nihilism are sort of two different things. When I speak to people face to face, it's easy for me to talk about nihilism because I know who they are. I know what aspects they're going to relate to or what this is going to mean to them. It's harder for me to talk about in a sort of generalized broadcast. I like to use the term historical nihilism. Historical nihilism is a term used by the Communist Party of China to describe the antithesis to their ruling ideology. Historical nihilism is an attitude where we learn from the lessons of history, but we deny the idea that history is an intrinsically evolutionary process. We deny the idea that everything is getting better and better. We deny the idea that everything is necessary. That so, for example, the Chinese Communist Party, they will justify the deaths of millions of people when people were massacred under Mao Zedong by saying, well, this was historically necessary, this was part of a positive evolutionary process, etc., etc. So historical nihilism to begin with is the idea that no, we study history, but we admit to ourselves that many of the things in history are meaningless, that many of the massacres and disasters did not contribute to progress, that they were just disasters, pure and simple. Now, this, of course, does not mean that history lacks in meaning or lacks in lessons for us to learn. I think, on the contrary, this opens the door to us really profoundly learning from history. But it is closing the door on an ideological or religious reading of history. Nihilism has had several other historical moments that also color the meaning of the term for me. The Russian nihilists had this catchphrase, go to the poor, be the poor. And the nihilists in Russia were in general a non-communist attempt to address the corruption and decadence of Russian society and to lay their hands on the problem of poverty and the social dysfunction of pre-revolutionary Russia. So that's another moment in history. It doesn't mean the nihilists had all the answers in life. Oh, I guess I could have mentioned this under the question about novels. There's a famous novel by Turgenev, the Russian author Turgenev, called Fathers and Sons. Fathers and Sons is probably the single most famous depiction of Russian nihilism as a philosophy. Although, of course, it's partly a caricature of or a critique of Russian nihilism. But I don't specifically identify with Russian nihilism, but it's another interesting moment in history when nihilism came to the fore as a concept. In terms of what is the core of nihilism, it is similar to ancient skepticism. Not skepticism the way the word is used today, but skepticism in the ancient Greek sense that sadly nobody seems to read or be aware of. There are two different things. If I say to you, there is no God, that is not really the same thing as saying to you, there is nothing to be believed in. Apart from a rejection of belief in a specific ideology, there is a critique of belief itself. That is the core of nihilism. Next question. Linda Carlson. I work for a company that extracts minerals from the ground. The mineral is essential for human welfare, but the mining process is not environmentally friendly. What is your opinion on having non-environmentally friendly jobs or non-vegan jobs? Okay, this is the last question in today's section, and I mean it's a simple one. Look, I as I mentioned, this year, just a couple months ago, I volunteered to join the Army. I volunteered to become a professional killer for the Canadian Armed Forces. You better believe it. That's not hypothetical. My signature is on the paper. I did the paperwork. I went in and wrote the tests. I went through the process. So, I mean, we all got to do something to survive. I talked about on YouTube, it was possible I would have gotten a job at Starbucks this year or what have you. That didn't happen. On the other hand, I have a storied career of quitting jobs for ethical reasons. So I'll try to tell this anecdote really briefly. But when I was in Cambodia, I had a job that on paper looked like the most morally positive job, but basically because of corruption and incompetence on the part of my boss, it was really quite immoral. You're doing healthcare research. Healthcare research can save lives. If it's corrupt, it can kill people, or at a minimum, it's failing to save those lives. It's squandering the opportunity to make that positive difference to save those lives through corruption, through incompetence, or what have you. So it did really damage me to quit that job when I did in Cambodia. I did not have any easy alternative to it, but that was the right thing to do morally at that time. And I tried to reform the way that company operated from the inside, and I tried to express the problems, etc. But if your inferiors are corrupt or incompetent, you can change things easily. When your superiors are corrupt or incompetent, then you got to quit. Now, if I had joined the army, who knows what kind of corruption and incompetence I would have encountered. But this is the real world. Coming back to the point I made before in response to the question from Mike, Mike asked about what's the most effective, and I talked about economic aspects of activism. Ultimately, all morality is a luxury, and when you do not have a better option. I mean, veganism at its core is about doing what's possible and practical, and if you are too poor, if you do not have the luxury to quit your job, if you do not have the luxury to even search for a new job to replace it, if you don't have a substitute, if you don't have an alternative, lock and load. Hey man, somebody's got to wake up in the morning and drop those bombs on the Islamic State. And I'm someone who comes out of a background of studying some of the worst disasters in American foreign policy. American foreign policy in Cambodia, in Laos, in Haiti, something else I've mentioned here. I have studied some of the worst examples of American military intervention, and America has made some of the same mistakes again and again. But nevertheless, when I had the opportunity or the seeming opportunity to sign up and be part of the next disaster, I signed up for it. And, I'm not a pacifist. I believe in minimizing harm, minimizing the harm caused by war, minimizing the harm caused by different forms of economic activity. But the minimum is certainly much more than zero. And it's interesting. I've lived through a number of in my lifetime, there have been a number of failed peace protests. I remember marching in the anti-war protests in Toronto that I believe still are the largest protests in the history of Canada, when people were protesting against starting the war in Iraq, what am I going to tell you? Today, there is no peace protests for ISIS, for the Islamic State. There are many conflicts of that kind in the world where there is a broad consensus that resorting to the brutality of force is necessary, and where it's proceeding. Mineral extraction, Canada is built on it, and there are very peculiar forms of violence that are built into resource extraction. What I feel is the real alternative for vegans to take seriously, and it's become very marginalized veganism. I've tried again and again to talk about a habitat conservation-centered approach to veganism. I think it's very misleading and counterproductive to demonize, for example, a specific crop, the way that some vegans demonize palm oil. Well, palm oil, if you stop farming palm oil, it doesn't help endangered species. It doesn't help the animals that would live in that forest. The only thing that will help them is habitat conservation. Is when you draw a line on the map and you don't say we can't farm palm oil here. You have to farm some other palm, date palms, anything like that. It's still any crop is still going to destroy the habitat. The one thing that will help the orangutans, that will help the wild animals in question, the only thing that will make the difference is habitat conservation, is where you draw a bunch of lines on the map and say inside these lines, we have no human exploitation of nature whatsoever. We have real jungle. We have real wilderness. And inside those lines, that's where the orangutans and the monkeys and the tigers and the elephants get to live. And that ultimately is also what I have to say about mineral extraction. You can't turn the whole world into Disneyland. There's got to be a line on the map. And on one side of the line, we have all the brutality of mining and mineral extraction. And on the other side, we have land that's being preserved not to benefit humans, not even for the sake of climate change or something, but that is there for the animals, for the forest, for the wilderness to exist as a true end in itself. Thanks for your time, guys. Thanks for writing in with these questions. I'm happy to hear them. I'm happy to answer them. I really do value the quality and caliber of the questions I received. Anyone can pay that $1 and comment and get my attention, but the $1 alone seems to be enough to really prevent trolls from signing up. Durian Rider says he's rich. Durian Rider has not paid the $1 to come online and bother me. He's welcome to do it. So it's amazing how much higher the intellectual caliber is simply by having that $1 as a barrier to entry, in contrast to the quality of comments you get on YouTube or on blogs or other sorts of websites. Thank you guys all very much. Thank you.